The Supreme Court just dropped a decision that could change the rules for millions of American workers and their employers. And it all boils down to one simple but really powerful question. When it comes to overtime pay, who has to prove what? So let's dive into this legal puzzle, shall we?
Have you ever looked at your paycheck and wondered, hey, am I supposed to be getting overtime for all those extra hours? Well, the answer to that question just got a whole lot more interesting, all thanks to a legal fight that went all the way to the top. In this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what this big decision means for you.
All right, so where does all this come from? It all starts, as these things often do, with a pretty classic workplace dispute. This wasn't some theoretical debate in a law school classroom. This involved real people fighting for money they believed they had earned.
At the very heart of this puzzle is a law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. You've probably heard of it. It's a landmark law from 1938 that sets the federal minimum wage and says, hey, if you work more than 40 hours a week, you get overtime. But, and this is really the key here, the law also carves out a bunch of exemptions for different types of jobs. And that brings us right to the folks at the center of this story. A group of sales representatives who worked for E.M.D. Sales, a food distributor, took their employer to court. Their claim was pretty simple. We're working way more than 40 hours a week, and we're not seeing a dime of overtime pay.
Now, E.M.D. wasn't arguing about the long hours. Their defense was something else entirely. They said, well, yes, but our reps are outside salesmen, and according to the FLSA, that category is exempt from overtime. So the whole thing hinged on whether the company could actually prove that claim.
And this, right here, is where we get to the real heart of the legal fight. It's a concept called the burden of proof. See, when an employer says an employee is exempt, the law says they have to prove it. But the big question is, how much proof is enough? That's what this whole battle was about. And look, this might sound like a tiny legal detail, but it is everything in this case. Does the company just need to show it's a little more likely than not that the employee is exempt, or do they have to meet a much higher, tougher standard of proof?
So in the world of civil law, you've basically got two different settings for how much proof you need. Think of it like the scales of justice. The lower standard is called preponderance-of-the-evidence. That just means the scales have to tip ever so slightly, just past 50-50. The higher standard, clear and convincing evidence, means you have to pile on enough proof to make those scales tip way over. It has to be highly probable.
Now, that first one, preponderance of the evidence, that's the default setting for most civil cases in the U.S. From contract disputes to personal injury, it's the go-to standard. The Supreme Court says it's designed to make sure both sides share the risk of a mistake pretty much equally. So this disagreement, this fight over which standard to use, that's exactly why this overtime dispute didn't just end there. It started climbing the ladder of the court system and went all the way to the top.
So let's follow the journey, right? First up, the district court sided with the employees. It told E.M.D., you have to meet that higher, clear, and convincing standard. E.M.D. didn't like that, so they appealed. But the Court of Appeals agreed with the first court, and that created a huge problem in our legal system.
And here's the kicker. The court that made this decision, the Fourth Circuit, they were completely on their own. Every other federal appeals court in the country that had looked at this exact issue had said the standard was the lower one, the preponderance standard. When you have different rules in different parts of the country like that, it's called a circuit split, and that's a big reason the Supreme Court steps in, to create one single rule for everybody.
And that's when the Supreme Court stepped in. The 9 justices took the case to settle this thing once and for all. So how did they figure it out?
Okay, so the court's logic here was actually pretty straightforward. They started with a really fundamental principle. That preponderance standard has been the normal, default rule in civil cases since way before the FLSA was even written. So their thinking was, unless there's a really good reason to use a higher standard, we should just stick with the default.
So the justices basically asked, okay, does an overtime case fit into one of the very rare exceptions where we do use a higher standard? And they laid out 3 main situations where that happens. 1, if a law specifically says to use a higher standard. 2, if the Constitution demands it, usually for really important rights like free speech. Or 3, in these super rare cases of extreme government action, like trying to take away someone's citizenship.
So after looking at those 3 exceptions, the court came back with a crystal clear and, get this, unanimous answer. Nope. An overtime case just doesn't fit the bill. The FLSA law doesn't say to use a higher standard. There are no fundamental constitutional rights on the line, and it's definitely not the government trying to take away citizenship.
And to really drive the point home, they made a really smart comparison.
They pointed out that even in huge, serious employment discrimination cases, the standard of proof is just preponderance of the evidence. So they basically said, look, if that's the standard for proving something as serious as discrimination, why on earth would we need a higher standard just to figure out an overtime exemption?
All right, so the legal dust is settled, the puzzle's been solved, but what does this actually mean for you, for real people in real jobs, and for the companies they work for?
Well, the single biggest thing this decision does is create clarity. We now have just one single uniform rule for every single one of these cases all across the country. No more confusion, no more different rules depending on where you live.
So here's the bottom line. For employers, this ruling means the bar they have to clear to prove an employee is exempt is now officially lower. And just as importantly, it's consistent everywhere. On the flip side, for employees, this could make it tougher to challenge being classified as exempt since their employer now has an easier legal hurdle to overcome in court. It's a subtle but pretty significant shift.
And that leaves us with one last, really interesting thought. The Supreme Court basically just set the rules for the fight. They clarified how it's supposed to be fought. But they didn't actually pick a winner. The case itself now goes back to the lower courts to be decided using this standard. The court told us how the game is played, but the question of who actually wins, well, that story is still being written.